Are you seeking your 13th term?
That's correct. I've been really fortunate, first being elected to serve back in the 90s, and now in my 25th year.
It's amazing. We spoke with a couple of Republican opponents for this office, candidates for this office, the other day, and they said that you had become a career politician. I imagine you have different thoughts about that, but talk about what keeps you going in this job and how long do you foresee doing it?
Well, I feel that this is a job in which I can really make a difference for the community that I love. I've said that I began my career when I was elected captain of the safety patrol at Bricker Woods Elementary, and I returned to Bricker Woods when I first made my announcement to run for Congress, and I'm now on a different kind of safety patrol in Washington. There are some real challenges to values that we hold dear, to issues that I care about. Of the time that I've been in Congress, Democrats have only been in control of the Congress and the White House for 2 years out of my entire tenure. That's when we were able to act on health care and to act on some of the Wall Street reforms. I would hope to be a part of a Congress that is able to do more than just play defense. At present, I'm very motivated by the threat that Donald Trump poses to our democracy and to respect for the truth. And so I see myself serving this term. You get a 2-year employment contract in Congress and have to justify to your employer, the people of this community, continued service. I don't plan to stay there forever. I've seen people who've stayed too long, but I feel I still have a great deal to contribute and that the community will benefit from the experience I bring serving now as the Health Subcommittee Chair.
As you travel Central Texas, and it's quite a wide-ranging district, what are the issues that people are talking about in 35? What are the most pressing issues you hear about every day?
Well, there are many concerns that people have: healthcare, significant immigration, the climate crisis. But there is one issue that really dominates everything, because we cannot make progress on any of those or a host of other issues so long as Donald Trump is in the White House. And I think the biggest concern and the most frequently mentioned issue is what can be done about a president whose entire approach is based not on really having an agenda to accomplish, but on division, on splitting us apart, pitting one part of our society against another, and who really, I believe, in his love of third world thugs, would like to move to more of a despotic government here, where he is the sole power and the other branches of government shrink into insignificance. Morning.
You support Medicare for all.
Some
people, even among Democrats, question whether that's a viable issue strategy. Questioning mainly, I guess, how do you pay for it? Can you talk a little bit about how you came to support that issue?
Absolutely. I support better Medicare for more Americans. And I have, in that regard, signed on to a number of health care bills that might take us in that direction. Medicare for all is one. A single-payer system might well be more efficient so that we get more Medicare for our dollars. Medicare has been an extraordinary success, and I think more Americans could benefit from it. I've also signed on as a sponsor of a different approach called Medicare for America, which relies more on Medicare, Medicaid, and other kind of healthcare systems. And I've signed on to an entirely different approach, which is a Medicare buy-in that would allow people, particularly people that are youngsters that are too young for Medicare, to buy into that system as they begin to have health problems in their 50s. I believe that out of all these approaches and others, we will get a better healthcare system. The agenda of the next Congress a year from now may well be dictated by what the courts do if President Trump and our indicted Attorney General Ken Paxton are successful in their collusion to destroy protection for pre-existing conditions and the entire Affordable Care Act. I think my first responsibility is to try to protect the millions of Americans that are relying on the Affordable Care Act. I was there in the Health Subcommittee when that law was written. It has many imperfections that need to be corrected. We will need to preserve it as we look forward to a Medicare system that can cover more people. In looking at whether it's Medicare for all or one of the other approaches that I mentioned, or simply reforming the Affordable Care Act, we do have to be fiscally responsible. And any system we put in place has to be paid for. I don't believe we can achieve universal coverage that I would like to have in one fell swoop. It would have to be phased in over time and paid for. And I believe really out of looking at all these proposals, we'll put together a package that can pass that will do more than we're able to do now. Among the improvements in Medicare itself that I am seeking is legislation that I've offered to cover hearing visual benefits. Those are not covered by, and dental, those are not covered by Medicare now. They would be under both Medicare for All and Medicare for America. And then I've been very involved in the issue of pharmaceutical price gouging, because I think pharmaceutical prices are out of control as a result of the monopoly power we grant manufacturers, and we need to push back and find a better way to resolve that.
So just to follow up on the Medicare for All type question, do you have a preference on which one of those paths? Because you mentioned several of them.
Yes.
Which one would you prefer?
I think there is some benefit to be had through a single payer system and having Medicare cover more people. I don't think that it is practical to cover all people with Medicare immediately. And I also believe, even in countries like Sweden, there is provision for those individuals who want to have some form of private insurance. And so I think it's a mistake, though included in the Medicare for All package, to simply eliminate every kind of insurance. So I think it's my experience with the work we did in developing the very imperfect Affordable Care Act is that we will take all these proposals and something will come out of it in the legislative process that I hope relies a little more on a single-payer approach and gets us in a phased-in system. We may want to look as the primary concern what happens to our children. I know you have editorialized about that in the last few weeks. It is really a tremendous scar on Texas that we lead the way in uninsured children, and much of that is due to the failure of the state Republican government to expand Medicaid. We never envisioned that states like Texas would refuse 100 federal cents on the dollar to provide coverage to children and other uninsured people here. I didn't mention this in my response to Juan, but in addition to trying to protect the coverage that people have now under the Affordable Care Act, one of my biggest concerns, and it's a concern that I've raised going back to the Obama officials in their implementation, not altogether good implementation of the Affordable Care Act, is what do we do about a state like Texas to reach our uninsured if we have continued opposition from the state government? We have too many uninsured people, children and adults in Texas, and I want to find a way to reach them. Medicare may be one of those approaches.
But you still see a place for employer-provided insurance at a certain level too, or?
Certainly in the near term I do.
Yeah.
I think that it's a question, we never really tried a single-payer type system when the public option was taken out of the Affordable Care Act and when there was over-reliance on Medicaid. I think that we are not going to see an immediate abolition of employer-provided health care. I do think a single-payer Medicare system could provide much benefit, but we need to be sure it's fiscally responsible, and it has to be done, I think, phased in over time.
You mentioned seeking to close down on pharmaceutical price gouging.
Right.
I know Senator Cornyn has also sponsored legislation, I believe, or written legislation along those lines.
Well, I would say that my approach, as on gun safety with Senator Cornyn, is very, very different. The
Tell us
main,
about the difference.
yes, the main problem with the Republican approach to pharmaceutical price gouging is they don't want to provide any kind of check on the monopoly power of pharmaceutical manufacturers to price gouge people. We have a system in America where the government grants a monopoly to a pharmaceutical manufacturer, and then with the exception of the Veterans Administration and a few other areas, it leaves that manufacturer able to exert monopoly power and charge whatever the sick and dying will pay for relief, unlike every other major industrial country. Senator Cornyn has had some very modest legislation that will not touch that. He did support a proposal Senator Grassley has advanced that has enjoyed significant resistance from Majority Leader McConnell to address some of the fringe issues here. But I think unless you get at monopoly power and you engage in Medicare negotiating with these drug companies, we will never see prices lowered. President Trump talked about all the wrongdoing of pharmaceutical manufacturers and said he was forbidding and that it would save billions of dollars, which it would. And then he's entrusted his agenda to some pharmaceutical executives who were involved in that very price gouging and has resisted major reform. At the same time, he's declared that prices are lower under his administration. They're not lower. The rate of increase has decreased slightly, but he's not advanced any effective reform. Another thing we could do is to look at the investment taxpayers make in research and development. I worked on that going back into the Obama years as well. We are spending a tremendous amount of money on research through the National Institutes of Health, through our universities, through the Defense Department, but again, taxpayers pay for the research, but there's no restraint on the price. I would try to provide some restraint. The bill that I introduced focused on bringing in competition, that if there was not effective negotiation, there would be the power to license for pay generic competitors to come in and compete to try to bring down prices through competition.
We've already touched on a couple of issues where people, most Americans, say they support legislation of one kind or another. For example, gun control. I think most people would like to see some changes, but nothing gets done. Is there a lane, some kind of path that you foresee, that you see, that would get things done in Congress, that would achieve some bipartisanship, some real bipartisanship to pass laws and reforms that polling clearly shows most people are in favor of?
Yes, I think there's a direct path, and that direct path relies on electing a president who wants to support those kind of reforms. Trump went back and forth every time there are another series of murders on what he would do about gun safety, and once the NRA whispers in his ear, then he backs off and will not lead any effective reform. It's really a tragedy. You really wonder how many Americans have to be murdered before the Congress has the courage and a president has the courage to do something about it. I support the universal background check law that we passed in the House that is lying there in Mitch McConnell's graveyard, where he won't permit the Senate to even debate that bill. I think we need to do something about high-capacity ammunition clips, about guns that were designed for the military and are designed solely to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. But as far as a bipartisan path, with the president resisting, with the NRA a force, we cannot get meaningful gun safety legislation passed through this Congress. Occasionally something symbolic, like the legislation I referred to early from Senator Cornyn, which amounted to essentially a strong letter to enforce existing law, that passes to create the impression Congress is doing something, but nothing meaningful is happening. Just one, if I could, address as well the broader topic, which I think you were referring to, of let's have bipartisan cooperation. I think there is a real yearning of so many people, I share it across America, of Why can't we put our country first and our parties aside and come together and work to solve some of these problems? Well, there are some very real reasons, as I pointed to with President Trump, when he accuses those of us who don't clap long enough for his speeches of treason, which he's done, when he says the only group worse than Democrats are Republicans who don't agree with them and refers to them as human scum. It is difficult to have an environment where you can come together because Republicans are intimidated to work with Democrats to resolve any of these problems, and there tends to be strong pushback on both sides. I'm ready to work with any person of goodwill, regardless of their philosophy, but I think we have to have a president who's helping to heal the country, divisions that go beyond just personalities in Congress, but split coffee table conversations right here in Central Texas, who works to heal and bring us back together. That president will have a really big job because another 11 or 12 months of hate speech from the White House will make it difficult, especially on issues like immigration, but on many others. And some of the members who are left on the Republican side after the Democratic gains in the suburbs are not what under any sense of the word, it's always been a little bit of an oxymoron, but under any sense of the word you could call moderate. They tend to be true Trump believers, and even with Trump gone, many of them will reflect the same attitudes on some of these issues.
Speaking of immigration, and trying to kind of attack it from
Right.
another end, the unemployment is down,
Right.
about the lowest ever in Texas. It's, 2%. Austin, it's, I think, almost less than 2% or close to it. We need, more workforce. We need people to come in. And at some point, you'd think some of the economic issues
Yes.
there to keep the engine going are going to have to, come about and force some change. Do you think there's any path to doing some reform in the near future?
I think there's so much work that needs to be done there. And yes, it is really impressive that our unemployment is as low as it is and that businesses here are talking about their workforce needs. And we need more advocacy from all elements of the business community who tend to benefit from having immigrants. Another study out recently about the economic benefits to Texas, particularly of providing a path to citizenship for our dreamers. In another, a totally different approach, I met last week with the head of a major company here in Austin who came to the University of Texas from Pakistan as a student and was able to stay here. Under the Trump administration, many of those legal immigrants are being discouraged, certainly from a Muslim country, in even coming here. They go to Canada or Europe. If they come here, they're not encouraged to stay here and contribute. The vibrancy that I've seen since my youth in Austin in this community has largely come from people, whether they were within the United States or the best and brightest from all over the world, in coming here to make this the exciting community it is today. And we are losing out economically, whether it's somebody who has a startup here or whether it's someone who comes to build in the construction industry or in the service industry from a poorer part of the world. We lose out when we exclude them. I've seen at times the economic studies that the Chamber, the Texas Association of Business, and other groups have done, but I haven't seen the political push necessary to get some of their natural Republican supporters to work with us to get a result. I think the high watermark in that regard was back 6-7 years ago when the United States Senate, as you know, passed a bipartisan, imperfect, but bipartisan bill that provided some security and dealt with guest workers, dealt with comprehensive immigration reform. We need to move back in that direction. The Supreme Court may well dictate, again, when we move on these things because of the decision that's pending there about the Dreamers, hoping that they will allow us enough time to act in a new Congress to protect them if they reject the case that's there. But I would like to see us do more than just the Dreamers and deal with this whole workforce issue.
Aren't there any moderates left in Congress? or in Texas, actually, congressional members in Texas?
Well, we do tend to, as the country, and it's reflected in our representatives, to move into our separate tribes, and that's a problem for our country of how we, under a new president, bring people back together. There are some people here in the Texas delegation and across the country that I work with, for example, within my committee, where we come together on perhaps not the highest profile issues, but help to resolve a tax problem or a healthcare problem. But there are a declining number of those moderates. I was with this week one of them, Will Hurd in San Antonio, who's chosen not to run. And that's true of a number of the Republicans who could not defend how much they were with Trump or how much they were against Trump in a primary or how much they were with Trump in the general election.
So is there any then background congeniality anymore,
Oh.
or is everything you see out in the public, it's so darn partisan split?
Yeah.
Everybody's seeing, there seems to be so much hatred there. Just
Yeah.
You hope that somewhere in the back halls there's some congeniality.
Well, there is congeniality. Even with the ranking member on my subcommittee, that is the top Republican on healthcare, is Devin Nunes of some fame or notoriety on intelligence. There's certainly congeniality and professionalism, but there's just a basic disagreement over where we ought to go in the country. There are angry words that are said, and I guess there are a few Republicans that I really dislike, but in the main, I'd say it's a professional, friendly relationship. It just, I think, an inability for them to overcome Trump, and in some cases, a basic agreement with the approach that he takes.
What about, you don't seem to hear any conversations anymore about the deficit and debt, and we just keep spend, and there really doesn't seem to be much fiscal management at all anymore, or even discussions of it. Where does this all end?
It is a serious problem. $1 trillion a year deficits, I think, are not sustainable. They are shifting responsibility from one generation to another. They limit our ability to respond to the next recession in not having the tools at that time to incur some deficits because we're already at such big limits. And it is very much a bipartisan problem. I think the problem that we have right now is largely a result of another huge unpaid tax cut that benefited the few and will be borne by future generations of the many. But it's not exclusively that. And I have met with some resistance within the Ways and Means Committee this year in raising these issues and have voted against some matters that I really would like to see approved because they were not paid for. In the last appropriations bill approved in December, I was one of the few Democrats to vote against it because it had almost $500 billion in additional unpaid tax cuts in it that I thought were a real mistake, even though I supported some of those tax changes. And so we do need much more pushback. We've become accustomed to liking the good parts, but not being willing to cover the politically painful parts, whether it is on direct spending or tax expenditure. So I think it's a big challenge for us going forward, and I see the problem having been significantly worsened by my Republican colleagues in the tax bill, but not enough interest in this from some of my Democratic colleagues that having complained about the Republican tax bill, we can't be in a position to just make it worse.
I hear a lot of discussions that some of it was kind of so loose that now you have groups that are actually trying to put the details behind some of the things for enforcement.
On
the
tax,
lobbyists on the tax bill, and
yeah.
the lobbyists are hitting them, and then there's actually more tax relief being given than was originally expected because of kind of the rush maybe it went through.
That is exactly right. There's been some great recent reporting about how the Treasury Department has gone far beyond even the general confines, even to off the record comments in one of the Times stories that I saw of Republican staffers saying we never intended it to go in this direction. There is much work that needs to be done about that tax law, particularly in the international area. I have long objected, before I went to the Health Subcommittee, I was the ranking Democrat on the Tax Subcommittee, have long objected to the notion that Pfizer pays a significantly lower tax rate than People's Pharmacy here or any independent community pharmacy in Central Texas. There is one gimmick after another. I have a stop outsourcing bill that now 100 plus members of the House have joined on, trying to promote that to address some of the loopholes that were in there. And you're certainly correct about the way this bill was passed. I don't believe there has been major tax legislation, indeed much minor tax legislation, that has gone through Congress without a single witness, without an academic, a business person, an administration official with the courage to come over and explain it. When you pass such massive legislation and you don't thoroughly review it and you do it on a rush schedule for political purpose, you end up with some results that are anathema to many portions of the business community, and should be anathema to everyone who has to pay the debt for doing it.
Yeah, I do think you're starting to get more of kind of citizens, even if you're for tax relief at a certain level. But when you see really big companies that pay nothing,
that's right.
I think that does start raising the ire of people that they may got a tax break and pay a little less, but they're still paying something.
Exactly, and there is much reform that's needed in that area.
I wanted to get back to gun control
Yes.
and gun violence. You mentioned that you filed a background checks bill, which is sitting on majority leader's desk, I guess.
Right.
It won't go anywhere. Yet the polling shows that Americans want some gun reforms, like background checks. Realistically, with Republicans in control on the Senate side and the president in office, what can be done on gun control? Can Americans expect anything, or are we just going to be in this holding pattern where there's one mass shooting after another and nothing is done of a significant scale?
I'd like to be the bearer of good news here, because it is one tragedy after another. We don't know where next week there'll be another shooting, others killed, where legislation might have prevented or reduced the danger. But I can't see this Congress in year 2020 doing anything meaningful about gun safety after the whole cause was abandoned by the president, after he said he would do something about it. The power of the NRA this year will prevent the Congress from doing anything. It obviously is influencing state governments, as shown by the recent protest in Virginia. I hope they will have the courage to go on and do something at the state level. We have the agenda of what needs to be done, and I hope that early in 2021 we can see at least the background check bill promptly approved. We really have a dozen or so bills that are major pieces of legislation dealing with climate, gun safety, equal pay, the Equality Act, the cleaning up the corruption and making our election system more electable, not more electable, but more participation in the election process by people, the For the People Act. All this legislation the House has approved. It's sitting in the Senate. It provides the framework for what under a new Congress we could be able to do, where we've already had the hearings and approved the legislation. It's a matter of getting not only a new president, but some new members of the Senate to help us pass that legislation. Without that, I don't believe we'll see serious action on gun safety.
Just to kind of get it out there, what is your general thought on Second Amendment and gun rights, and what there should be? What should it look like?
Well, my first interaction with the National Rifle Association was a successful one from my standpoint. As a young state senator representing this community, I learned about the problem of what at the time were called cop killer bullets that could penetrate Kevlar. And I passed through the Senate a bill to ban cop killer bullets in Texas. the NRA did not have its current level of strength, began opposing it in the House, and we were able to overcome that in the House. And though it seems impossible, which it is in today's Texas, it was signed into law, and it is in the law books originally way back many years ago. In running for Congress initially in the 90s, the NRA was working to repeal the assault weapons ban. I dealt with them actually in my political advertisements, saying that I thought it was important to continue that ban at a time that even George Bush was saying that he supported the assault weapons ban. The power of the NRA has been so immense that for many years during the time I have been in Congress, they largely just took the issue off the agenda on assault weapons and otherwise. I believe as someone who grew up here in Central Texas around guns, went hunting with my father, remember the morning when he got a Winchester 30-30 for getting the first deer in Travis County. At a time, there was enough space in Travis County to do deer hunting. And so I respect the rights under the Second Amendment and the tradition of guns here in Texas. But you don't need an assault weapon to do anything other than chew up a deer because they're designed only to kill people. And I don't think we need these military-style assault weapons. And I believe, consistent with the Second Amendment, that they can be banned just as machine guns and bazookas might be banned. And I think there's nothing inconsistent with the Second Amendment in having the same rules apply to internet sales and gun shows that apply down the street here at a gun shop. I think high ammunition clips go hand in hand with these military assault weapons. And so I see preserving the right of sports people, hunters, to have their weapons without posing the level of violence that we see from guns in our society at present.
Yeah, the difference in background checks doesn't make any sense. Either everybody gets a background check or nobody gets a back. I mean,
Exactly.
It really doesn't make sense that you just go, if you don't want a background check, you just go by over there.
It's just a result of lobbying at the time to weaken the law. And we need enforcement of laws we have now, as the NRA always says, but we need to close those loopholes and make it meaningful enforcement.
But do you think I'm sorry, I'm
Sure.
just kind of going back. Did you say that you think that maybe you could that even in this current that you think
No,
that you could, or you think
I
it's
don't.
not going to happen?
You end up with something that is a sop like the bill that was passed last year by Senator Cornyn that tells the military to do what it was already required by law to do in reporting those who shouldn't have a gun as determined during military service,
Right.
but do nothing else. Another example of the challenge we face right now, one of those bills that I mentioned that's in the McConnell graveyard is the Violence Against Women Act. Mm-hmm. That was passed with strong bipartisan support in the past, but because there is a provision in it that's referred to as closing the boyfriend loophole, that while you can get protective orders already for a couple that are married or that have a child together, but it doesn't apply to boyfriends, that the Republicans won't permit the debate of that bill in the Senate. And the Violence Against Women Act overall has played such an important role for all of the shelters around the country, is held up in the Senate and not reauthorized, all over guns, and a fairly minor gun change.
Right.
We're just about out of time, but I wanted
Glad to visit with
you. We should talk about impeachment for just a couple of minutes.
Sure.
The trial gets underway shortly. Short of removal from office, which doesn't seem likely, what do you hope is accomplished with this trial?
Well, I think there's a question of whether there really is a trial, except in name only. If there will be no evidence presented that the House gathered, if there are no witnesses, that's not really a trial, it's just a cover-up. I believe this whole process, which I did not come to immediately, but only after other avenues of trying to hold this president accountable were unsuccessful, that the entire process is educating the American people about the wrongdoing that's occurred here and about the desire of this president to assume as much power as he possibly can assume for himself in what would be a basic shift away from democracy of America. And I believe, as long as I've been involved in public policy, I have never seen a greater threat to American democracy than posed by Donald Trump. And so to the extent that Americans who want to see a real trial recognize that the president's protectors and enablers will not permit that trial, all Americans become the jurors and will get to make the final decision in November. I would like to see a fair and open trial to find out more about the issues that Lev Parnas has raised about the participation of all members at the top of the administration. It is amazing that an administration which has said so often they'd like to get everybody out there no longer wants the president's chief of staff, the Secretary of State, the other people around him, his national security advisor or former national security advisor, to tell their story. And the reason is because they fear the truth more than anything else, the truth that they have ignored with one lie after another. So I believe the impeachment process has served a purpose. It satisfied a constitutional responsibility that we had as members of the House to stand up for the Constitution and reject the notion that checks and balances no longer apply. But at this point, it does not look optimistic in the Senate unless there are 4 Republican senators who are willing to demand witnesses. I hope they will.
Any other hot issues that we're missing here that you want to bring up, or kind of things to look out for?
Well, thanks. I think there are many, and one that I would touch on is the climate crisis. Yeah. I'm pleased that the city of Austin, Mayor Adler, has led in getting mayors to join in climate action plans. San Antonio, of which I represent a significant portion, adopted a slightly weaker climate action plan. I've talked with the city of San Marcos about doing one for a smaller community. I'm hopeful that there'll be enough communities around the country that will continue to address this issue, that will have a basis for action at the federal level. I believe that each month we put off a resolution of this, it becomes more politically difficult to do anything. We're seeing Australia burn, but we're also seeing mosquito-borne illnesses in Georgetown and Williamson County. Right. The weather intensity that is so Texas, but now has achieved just incredible high proportions. So I believe that is an existential crisis that we've got to address and to address soon and to address probably in a more far-reaching way than the Paris Accord does is very important. And then to move from that global problem that affects us right here in Central Texas to a more local issue that you have focused a great deal of attention on. The homelessness challenge is a great one. I think Governor Abbott has certainly engaged in the kind of Trump wannabe approach that I would expect of him to not contribute to a solution. I don't believe there is any panacea. I like what Community First has done and some of the other efforts. I'm en route to LifeWorks, which is focusing on youth homelessness. We need more federal support as well, not just in terms of housing, but in terms of what we do with mental health and in substance abuse. And it's the kind of issue. Another we could talk about at some length is infrastructure and transportation. And the great challenge is that while Austin is a more vibrant city than the one I grew up in, we become immobile, and how we will deal with that. And then the great issues of war and peace and the danger the president has exposed us to with an assassination without any imminent threat would be among a few that we could take up another hour or so talking about.
Yeah, you're right about that. That's for sure.
Yes.
That's for sure.
Thank you all very much.
Thank
Really appreciate the chance to visit with you.
Time.
Good.
Appreciate it.